So here are the four major tissue types: epithelium, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. As you can see that the epithelium is a type of tissue that often provides us the covering, right, like the skin. And the cells are often forms a community. They're linked to each other. Okay, they're linked together like this. Now, connective tissue, however, the cells are not connected to each other. In fact, there might be some distant, right? So here's one cell, here's another cell, here's another cell. And their often function is to connect, or they might fill in a space, for example. And they produce a lot of extracellular matrix, right? So they might look something like this. And of course, this is one type of connective tissue known as the loose areolar. Muscle tissue tends to, when I put in two lines with one dot, mean to function. Okay? Function is to contract. Epithelium function is to provide covering. Okay. Connective tissue is a broad group, but in general, it connect, like the name, the function is to connect different cells, different organs, and so forth. Nervous tissue, we're going to see function. In fact, when we talk about the nervous tissue, there seems to be really three important processes that the nervous tissues are involved, which is, in general, we say sensory. Sensory means the ability to detect the changes, either externally or internally. Integration. Integration means give value. Integration. Give values to the, or the significant to the sensory information. And then finally, an important one is called motor. Motor is part of acting, right? And when we talk about the nervous system, that there's a central nervous system, CNS, and this is a nice exam question. What are the two organs that makes up the central nervous system? Well, that's the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, and then you have a system that is outside of that. We call it the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. Okay, and PNS is periphery. If it's bringing the information, we call it sensory division. If it brings the motor out, it's known as the motor division. And this usually activates the effector. And the effector here could be, say, the skeletal muscle to contract, or the heart to pump faster, and so forth. Okay. All right. Let's go through the, as you can see, epithelium provide covering, lining the internal passageway. In a way, it's also formed gland. So, just like you would say that the cell might have invaginations of the plasma membrane, like this. This is part of the endocytosis. Endocytosis. As the key word is invagination. The word vagin as in vagina means sheet. Okay. Sheet. Like the scabbard, like the sheets of the sword, invagination. Now, this is known as endocytosis. This is within the cell, right? Now, if you have, however, say here's an epithelium, cell, 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 cell. Now, look at what happened, we call it invaginations of the epithelium. So that means it's just going to go down like this. Right? So the invaginations of the epithelium will actually form what we consider as a gland. Right? And if I haven't talked to you before, maybe it's good to think of what's the difference between an endocrine gland versus exocrine gland. Okay? Now, a gland that secretes some substance into the duct like this, right? This is known as an exocrine gland. So in the skin integument system, one of the questions might be with the integument system is, what are some of the glands? You know, the gland could be, say, merocrine gland or sweat gland. You know, you all know what sweat is. It secretes watery substance into the duct, if you will. Okay. The apocrine gland which secrete a little more oily substance into the duct as well of the base of the hair follicle, for example. And that's the exocrine gland. In fact, the mammary gland is also an exocrine gland because it secretes into the mammary gland duct, which then empty into the areola or the nipple. Okay. The endocrine gland, however, is a gland that secretes hormone into the blood. Into the blood. And it doesn't use the duct at all. In fact, the endocrine system is known as the ductless system. Right? So make sure you know this. It's the ductless system. Okay. Connective tissue fill in the internal space, support other tissue, transport or store energy. And store of energy here is the most important tissue would be the adipose tissue, which is stored fat, which can be used as an energy reserve, adipose. Transport material like the blood is specialized connective tissue. Okay. Support other tissue, this could be a number of things like loose areolar. We're going to see what is the difference between tendon and ligament. Okay, tendon and ligament. Okay, so tendon is usually tendon is a connection between muscle and bone, whereas ligament is connection between bone and bone. Another way you could also group this connective tissue is that depends on the fibers that these cells produce. Are they highly organized or is it disarray? Tendons and ligaments, they tend to be highly organized. There are not a lot of blood vessels, so it's harder to see, but they're highly organized connective tissue. So here could be the cell, here could be the cells, but these are connective tissue that is really highly organized. Okay, and you know, like loose areolar, like the term implies, is that the fiber is everywhere, like that. So we call that loose areolar connective tissue. And loose areolar is often found between muscle, if you will. Okay? Between muscle. They're kind of like spider web. That's exactly what they look like. Muscle specializes in contraction, as you can say, be able to distinguish what kinds of muscle. Is it skeletal, is it hard, or is it smooth muscle? Skeletal is the only muscle that you can tell it when to contract, so we call that voluntary. Okay, voluntary. Whereas the heart muscle, we cannot, we call that involuntary, and the smooth muscle oftentimes is involuntary. But histologically, you can see these differently. The skeletal muscle would have striation, heart muscle would have striation, smooth muscle do not, right? And we can go through them. Neural tissue, we mentioned earlier, they carry electrical impulse involving sensory information, or even the brain integration, or providing the motor stimulation to the effector. Okay, are there any questions regarding the general overview of histology? All right, so there's going to be a lot of examples, but I'm just going to go through them and make sure you know them, okay? All right, now epithelial, as you can see here, general characteristic, as you can see, just provide covering. That's all it is. In general, epithelium is cell. The keyword is avascular. Avascular means no blood supply, right? And while in some epithelial tissue, and we're going to find out there, you can classify epithelium depends on the type of cell. Is it flat? You know, you guys already seen this in the lab. It's called squamous. If it's more like a cube, we call this cuboidal, right? If it's more like tall and slender, we call this columnar, okay? And if it's one layer, we call it simple. If it's multiple layer, we call it stratified. If it's look like it's multiple layer, we call that pseudostratified. Mm-hmm. And the functions depends on where you find them, but their function, as you can see, they're numerous. Obviously, in the skin, it's protection. In the skin, you can secrete, but in the case of glandular, which is a modified epithelium, provides secretion. A lot of epithelium, particularly, they have increases surface area, like the villi or the microvilli of the small intestine is involved in absorption. Excretion is the ways to get rid of something. You see a lot in the kidney, excreted your nitrogenous waste, which is part of your urine that have things like urea, ammonia, creatinine, and so forth. It classifies the type of epithelium between the shape of the share, the shape of the cell, and the number of the cell. Okay, provides the color. We talk about glandular structure, the function, very similar to what I talked to you about earlier. Now, here is one of the most important characteristic that you can say that epithelium is different from connective tissue. And that is, in order for the epithelium to work efficiently, they must work together as a community, okay? As a community, okay? Cells in the epithelium work together as a, I'm going to write this down, community. Okay. And in order for it to work together as one community, they must link together And what are those linked together? The three tight junction you see a lot. Desmosome, which is the strongest. These are all you consider as intercellular junction, if you will. Desmosome is the strongest. You see that in the skin. Gap junction typically have holes in them that allows the cells to work together as in one cell. So in other words, if one cell contract, all the cells contract, if you will. So in the smooth muscle, for example, the process in which how food propels down the esophagus is contraction. And so that if one particular part contracts, all of the smooth muscle within that region contract at the same time. So then the food can propel downward, known as peristalsis, for example, peristalsis. Here to show you, for example, the intercellular connections between cell and cell. Okay, you see here is desmosome between cell and cell. Now remember, this is the strongest, right? The cell can also attaches to the basement membrane, and the basement membrane is a matrix that is found underneath, right? So you can see here, here's a matrix. Right, we call this the basement membrane. In this case, it's only half of the desmosome, or also known as a hemidesmosome. Okay? In fact, this is also a good appreciation for the difference between simple stratified and pseudostratified. Okay? Now, in the case of simple epithelium, you can define a simple type of epithelium as this, and that is all of the cell touch the basement membrane. Okay? They're all binds to the basement membrane via the hemidesmosome, if you will. Okay, hemidesmosome. That's a simple epi. Okay. Now, in the case of stratified, is that you can say, well, there's one layer of cell that is in contact with the basement membrane, and the top layers do not. These do not. Okay, so this is considered as stratified epithelium. Okay, only one layer touches it, but not the top layer. Right? Now, there is a type of epithelium that looks like there are multiple layers. You have one layer here, but they look like there's another layer up there, right? And so this is not really a true stratified, because in fact all of these cells touch the basement membrane, right? So we will call this as pseudostratified. Pseudostratified epithelium. The word pseudo means false. You know, like you might say, oh, Trump's doctor is a pseudoscientist, for example, right? He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not, you know, he's saying that, oh, okay, I'm not going to say anything. Political statement, false, right? Or you can say, oh, she is a pseudo-intellectual. I mean, she thinks that she knows it, but she doesn't. Or the professor is a pseudo-intellectual individual. The guy's a crap. Okay, a quack. All right, so here's a difference between simple, all the cells touch the basement membrane, stratified, only one layer, and typically the layer that is closest to the this layer here, only the layer that is closest to the basement membrane usually divide. Okay, they can divide. In fact, the epithelium is a type of tissue that is rapidly dividing. That's something that is Also very important to keep in mind. Okay. So that's stratified. So stratified, all the cells touch the basement membrane, but they look like they're multiple layers. Okay. All right. So touch the basement membrane via hemodesmosome. So form strong connections to each other. Each other is desmosome. As you can see here, now cells that can communicate each other is to the gap junction, which has, here's a closer gap junction. They have a channel, if you will, between them that allows diffusions of ion, particularly calcium, if you will. And they also form a network, a community via the tight junction that you can see here. Okay. Tight junction. And then you can see tight junction, there's no hole in tight junction. Hole is only in gap junction. There's no hole in desmosome. Hole is only in gap junction. So oftentimes, the layer that is closest to the basement membrane, that is the layer that is dividing. That was the layer that had the stem cell. That stem cell, typically in the skin, for example, right? The skin will be, so here will be my integument system review for you guys, if you will, or introduction. The skin, most of the skin will have 4 layers of cells, okay? Except the palm and the sole have 5 layers of cells, okay? 5 layers of cells. And the 5 layers of cells, so my question for you is, you know, if you use a pen and you push this through the skin, what are the 5 layers of cells that it will reach? This is the first one, and then the second one, the third one, the fourth one, and the fifth one, right? The needle is going through. And it's really easy to remember this. I think I talked to you already, right? So the first top layer is known as stratum. Stratum corneum. Corneum is like, good. Stratum corneum, what is the top second layer? Stratum lucidum, right? Lucidum. What is the third layer? Stratum granulosum. Granulosum. And then stratum spinosum. And then this one is stratum basal, or basal means base, or it's also known as the stratum germinatum. Germinatum, or it has germinative cells, as you can see here, germinating, like dividing, right? So easy to remember. Remember I told you that the way that you remember this is, come on, come on, come on, okay? Let's get some breakfast. All right, so how can you miss that nice, simple exam questions, the 5 layers? Now, typically you only see 4 layers, but if you have 5 layers, this is the 5 layers, okay? C there's for corneum, L's there's for lucidum, G is for granulosums, S for spinosum, and basal for breakfast. The word lu, the root word for lu is light, okay? Like lucent technology was involving in in optic fiber. Have you ever heard like illumination? I mean, like lighting. A lot of light bulb has like, their different degree of lightness. It's called 10 illuminations or 15 illumination and so forth. The word lu is mean light. So this is the area that is very light. And you don't see this in the 4 parts of the skin. In the 5 part you see this, but in the 4 part you don't see that. Okay. The important thing is that this layer is constantly dividing. Okay. Yeah, I might have one clinical question for you, and that is, cancer cell that is constantly dividing, that divide really fast, right? So we have drugs, things like chemotherapy, okay? Chemotherapy. And these are the drugs that are used to block the rapidly dividing cancer cell, okay? These are your rapidly dividing cancer cell. Right? Now, you take another cells of the nervous system like a neuron who's not really dividing, right? So in this individual, you treat them with chemotherapy, trying to target cancer cell, right? But the side effect is going to mostly affect the epithelium more because the cell is constantly dividing as opposed to neuron, which is not constantly dividing, right? And it's no wonder that the hairs in your follicle is constantly dividing. If those cells that is no longer dividing because you got the drug that is killing cancer cell is also blocking the cell from dividing, and you get your hair fall off, if you will. Your gastrointestinal tract is constantly dividing, but you blocks the cells of your gastrointestinal tract in dividing, they cannot replace of the old cells, then you get sickness like diarrhea and vomiting and so forth. Now, let's do a couple more before we take a break. Classification of epithelium, where I say if it's thin, squamous, cuboidal, columnar, simple epithelium or stratified epithelium. And your job is to give you some example. If I tell you what are the example of the simple squamous in the inner lining of a blood vessel and in the respiratory tract, in the lung and in the kidney, it might behoove you to know where you might find those simple squamous epithelium. Okay, I talked to you, and already you have to know those areas. So my question is, okay, where would you find, what type of epithelium would you be, what kind of epithelium would you see in the, for example, the inner lining of a blood vessel, for example, the lung, or the inner lining, simple squamous. The correct answer will be the simple squamous. Right, exactly. Simple cuboidal, 2 areas that you often see are thyroid gland and the kidney, renal tubule. Okay, kidney. We call it the renal tubule. All right, so where would you find simple columnar epithelium? Gastrointestinal tract is good. Okay, GI tract. GI. Okay, good. So you can see here, this gastro refers to stomach and small intestine tract, if you will. Stratified typically an area that you see a lot of things that go over movement across it. To prevent, the key word here, stratify, is to prevent abrasion. Okay? Abrasion means wear and tear, like abrasive material. You use abrasive material to clean your non-stick pan, you're going to destroy it. It's too abrasive. It's damaging. And to prevent your things that can go through over the surface to damage the vital organ underneath, you have stratify. Okay? And sometimes it has keratin. So the stratify epithelium, there you go. We already talked about the integument system already. Will be the skin, if you will. Okay? The skin you would define as stratify squamous epithelium, often it's keratinized. Okay, keratinized. It has keratin, which is like a protective layer. So the skin, simple cuboidal, say mammary gland, simple columnar, not very rare. I wouldn't even bother to remember them. Okay, but these four typically is good. Okay. All right, here will be mesothelium. Okay, not too important here, but typically there's a type of epithelium. If it forms an inner lining, oftentimes we call that endothelium, and that's a very good term. The inner lining of the blood vessel is known as the endothelium. Okay, or the heart is known as the endothelium. Now, simple squamous in the case of the lung is for diffusion. Okay. Diffusion is like, say, oxygen in sort of inhalation or release of the blood vessel is also, oxygens and nutrients can also diffuse to this simple squamous epithelium. Mesothelium is the lines of the body cavity. That's the name, the meso. Meso means metal. All right, here's the simple squamous. Good location will be simple squamous. I would say in the lining of the blood vessel. It's good. In the lining of cornea, this is your cornea. In the lung, okay? Blood vessel and the lung of your lysal lung, you can see. And that's a really nice two area. Pericardial is the membrane that is surrounding the heart. You can see them as well. Okay. But I would say, good one, circle it, blood vessel and the lung. Squamous keratin, which is usually I talk about stratify, has keratinized, particularly skin, is to provide us protection and prevent water loss, if you will. Stratified squamous, you guys might see it in the lab. It's part of the vagina, the anus, right? Here, mouth, rectum, vagina, anus, and also the skin. That's easy to identify. The skin might be keratinized, or the other one is not keratinized. Right? All right. So simple squamous summarized. There's another types of vessel. It's known as lymphatic. The lymphatic is kind of like a blood vessel, but they carry interstitial fluid and it has a lot of lymphatic lymphocyte. as you will, cells of the immune system. They also have a simple squamous as well. But I think, you guys just know two good examples of simple squamous is the lung and the inner lining of the blood vessel. Cuboidal, two good area example of simple cuboidal is in the kidney and in the thyroid gland. Okay. Stratified cuboidal, the mammary gland, mammary duct, that's good. Just simple cuboidal and stratified cuboidal. And you can say what cuboidal looks like, kidney tubule, you can see here. Kidney tubule, beautiful. Thyroid gland, that's the textbook, if you will, thyroid gland. I mean, if you learn this, part of this thing will be in the practical too, I think, and then part of this is a lecture. So, two birds with one stone. Thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland is an endocrine gland. It secretes like T3 or T4. Here is the thyroid gland. It secretes T3 or T4, which is regulate metabolism. Stratified cuboidal. This is more like the mammary gland or the sweat gland. See, this is an exocrine gland because they secrete into the duct. Okay, and sweat is just basically liquid. Right? That's what sweat is, and the whole purpose of making this so you can have water on your surface, and by evaporations of that water, you're carrying heat away. So sweat is produced when you develop a hyperthermia, if you will. Since this is a lot of liquidy kind, it's also known as merocrine gland, as opposed to the mammary gland, which secrete a little bit of proteins in there. We call that apocrine gland. And there are other glands in which that produces the whole cells that die. That's known as the holocrine. So we're going to come back to different kinds of glands in a little bit. But a good example of a sweat gland is liquid, and liquid is merocrine gland. Okay. Let's show up the epithelium, and then we'll take a break. A simple cuboidal, you can see kidney, and a thyroid gland. It's a good example. Okay. Transitional epithelium. Now, transitional epithelium or epithelium that often you found in the urinary tract. So like the ureter, the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder is a good one. Okay, here's urinary bladder. And it's transitional, meaning that in some situation it's the flat, and in some situation it's not as flat. And it's true, right? Because if you think about it, the urinary bladder function is to store urine. And when your urinary bladder has a lot of urine, it's going to distend, right? It's going to get big. As such, the wall, the cells that forms a wall, is going to be flat, okay? And when you empty it, then it's actually no longer, urine pushed against the wall. They might come, you might see an infolding. The word infolding is known as rugae. Infolding. Rugae. And you see this rugae in the stomach as well. Okay, rugae. Let's see. Rugae. Okay, inner folding or rugae. All right. Appearance of stretch, stretching and recoiling. And here's a good example of the urinary bladder. And you can see how epithelium is stretched. It's going to different from when it's relaxed, as you will. Okay. This is known as more transitional epithelium. So in the future, if I ask you, where would you find transitional epithelium? Think of the urinary tract. Urinary tract is oftentimes what you see them. Transitional urinary bladder, ureter, urethra. Okay, so here they look like a little more squamous. Here they look like more cuboidal, multiple layer. And then lastly, columnar epithelium. The simple columnar is oftentimes in the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. If it's pseudostratified columnar, that's usually is the respiratory tract. Respiratory tract. Like the trachea is a good example. Okay, trachea, pseudostratified. Trachea. And stratified columnars, usually for protection, don't even worry about this columnar. Okay? So here's your example of simple columnar, right? Simple columnar in the gastro tract. Here, again, you can see that there is microvilli to increase the surface area, which is to increase absorption, for example. Okay? And that's your good example of the stomach and intestine. Hence the name the GI tract. Okay? That's a good example, so you can get a gist of it. Here's pseudostratified. They look like multiple layers, but in fact, all these cells touch the basement membrane. Okay? Here is it looks like this, right? But this is involved in movement, so we call cilia. Okay, and the pseudostratified ciliate of the respiratory tract is to move the mucus, which is usually up here. Okay, you move the mucus, and the mucus trap the dust, if you will, and we call it muco-excretory hypothesis, meaning that the cilia move the mucus upward, right, in the lower respiratory tract and upward, and then you can swallow it. As you can see here, move the mucus with cilia and trachea, bronchus. So here's your trachea. Here's the two bronchi, right bronchus, left bronchus, and then obviously the nasal as well. And columnar salivary glands, stratified columnar, don't even worry about that. Okay. All right, simple cuboidal summarizes similar thing. GI tract sometimes possess microvilli, GI, stomach, and intestinal. That's what GI is, gastrointestinal. The stratified, this is just stratified squamous, uterus, vagina. I'm sorry, the vagina and the skin, you can see. Stratified columnar, sweat gland, mammary gland is a good example. Stratified columnar, we say, or stratified columnar. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. This is important. The pharynx, okay. The pharynx is that, let's say, okay. All right. Now here's the mouth, here's the nasal. So posterior to the nasal and the mouth oral cavity is this structure right here. Okay. And that structure is known as the pharynx. You see here? The pharynx. The pharynx is in fact is divided into three regions. Okay. If it's posterior to the nose, it's known as the oral pharynx. If it's posterior, if it's posterior to the nasal cavity, it's known as the nasal pharynx. If it's posterior to the oral cavity, it's known as the oral pharynx. And if it's posterior to the larynx, it's known as the laryngeal pharynx. Okay? Now, the structure that you see here that looks like your Adam's apple, right here, is known as the larynx. So in fact, this thing goes like this, right? So you have three regions, 1, 2, and 3. And down here you have your trachea. Okay, so the pharynx has these three regions here, but the nasal pharynx here, up here, this one right here, now this is only passageway for only air. Only air can passes through this. So this would be considered pseudostratified. Okay, the nasal pharynx is pseudostratified. But the other two, the oryngopharynx and the laryngopharynx, and from laryngopharynx it goes down to the esophagus. Okay, this too is a passageway for both food and water. Air and food. Right? Whereas this is only air, but this is air and food. So because you don't want to get abrasion, you would see that both of these as stratified. And they're stratified columnar. And that will be considered stratified columnar epithelium. So that's why here it says part of the pharynx, not the whole pharynx, but part of the pharynx. All right, so let's stop here. Let's take a 5-minute break. I'm going to stop the recording here.